A ship lies buried under a desert, far from any sea. This single incredible find shattered everything we thought we knew about our ancient past. It is the key to understanding a prehistoric trade war, a hidden conflict that shaped the world before history was written. By the end of this story, you will see how a struggle for resources sparked global connections thousands of years earlier than anyone believed. How did a seafaring vessel end up entombed in sand? And what does its cargo reveal about a war fought with commodities instead of swords? What does it truly mean to be a civilized society? The desert air itself seemed to reject the idea. Under a sun that bleached the sky, a team of archaeologists brushed away grains of sand, not from a potsherd or a bone, but from a long, curved timber. It was the unmistakable shape of a ship's hull, laughter mixed with disbelief. A ship, here, in the heart of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, a sea of sand hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The initial assumption was a mirage, a trick of the heat, but the wood was solid and real. The excavation that followed was a painstaking ballet of brushes and trowels, each movement revealing more of the vessel's ghostly outline. They used radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of a radioactive form of carbon in organic material, to pin a date to the timber. The results were staggering. This ship was not hundreds but thousands of years old, built around 4,000 years ago. That single date shattered the timeline. It placed this seafaring vessel in an era when, according to every map, it should have been impossibly landlocked. The immediate, haunting question was no longer what it was, but how it arrived. Its silent presence in the sand was a geological accusation, pointing to a world that was profoundly different from our own. The wood itself held the answer, a silent clock counting down the millennia. To read that clock, scientists employed two remarkable techniques. The first, radiocarbon dating, acts like a cosmic hourglass. All living things absorb a tiny, predictable amount of radioactive carbon from the atmosphere. When they die, that absorption stops, and the radioactive carbon begins to decay at a steady, measurable rate. By analyzing how much remained in the ship's timbers, they could calculate the time that had passed since the tree was felled. But they went further, using a second method called dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Each ring represents 1 year of growth, and the pattern of wide and narrow rings creates a unique fingerprint, a timeline of wet and dry seasons. By matching the pattern in the ship's wood to master chronologies built from ancient trees, they could pinpoint the exact year the trees were cut. The results were unequivocal. This vessel was built around 4,200 years ago. That date is a thunderclap in the silent hall of history. It places the ship's construction 1,000 years before the Trojan War, centuries before the Great Pyramids of Giza cast their long shadows. This was not a relic of the classical world or even the early Bronze Age empires we read about. This ship sailed in a lost epoch, a time so deep in prehistory that it exists only in fragments and whispers. Suddenly, the anomaly had an address in time. It was no longer just a ship in the desert. It was a messenger from a forgotten age of exploration, a period when humanity's reach may have been far greater than we ever dared to dream. The ship's timbers were more than just a clock, they were a blueprint. Every plank and joint told a story of the hands that shaped them. The wood itself was not local, but cedar, a prized material imported from the distant mountains of Lebanon. This choice was the first clue to a vast trade network, revealing that these builders had access to the finest resources and knew exactly which wood could withstand the relentless rot of seawater and the strain of long voyages. But the true genius was in the assembly. The planks were not nailed together. Instead, they were fastened with a sophisticated system of mortise and tenon joints, where a protruding tongue on one plank was locked tightly into a carved slot on the next. This created a hull that was both incredibly strong and remarkably flexible, allowing the ship to twist and bend with the ocean's power instead of fighting against it. This was a masterclass in hydrodynamics, the science of moving through water, conceived millennia before the term was even invented. The vessel's broad, rounded hull was designed for capacity, not for speed or raiding. It was a cargo ship, a prehistoric freighter built to carry immense weight across vast distances. Its very form speaks of a culture that was not just coastal, but truly oceanic, whose prosperity depended on moving goods across the open sea. This level of naval engineering rivals that of the Phoenicians or the Vikings, but it existed in a shadowy era we barely recognize. What kind of society possessed such advanced knowledge, and what were they transporting that was so valuable it required a ship of this magnitude? The answer was waiting in the hold, buried beneath the sand. But the ship's true voice was not its hull, it was its cargo. When archaeologists carefully sifted through the sand that filled the hold, they uncovered a silent marketplace. Here were the raw materials of an ancient world's ambition. There were ingots of copper, heavy and green with age, their shape like stretched ox hides, a standard form that would be recognized by metalsmiths from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Alongside them were bundles of rare ebony wood, darker than night, destined to become furniture for a king or a high priest, but the most telling finds were the smallest. Tiny beads made of carnelian, a gemstone with a fiery red glow, each one drilled with a precision that spoke of specialized workshops, and sharp, black blades of obsidian, a volcanic glass that could hold an edge sharper than modern steel. Each of these items was an outsider. Chemical analysis revealed that the copper originated from mines in Oman, far to the east. The ebony could only have come from the forests of India. The carnelian beads were chemically matched to sources in the distant Indus Valley, and the obsidian, incredibly, was traced to a specific volcano in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. This was not a collection of local trinkets. This cargo was a map, a physical network of trade routes spanning thousands of miles from the mountains of Turkey to the rivers of India. It proved this ship was not on a simple coastal hop. It was a dedicated freighter on a marathon journey, a vital link in a chain of commerce that connected entire continents. These were not luxury items for a few, but the essential ingredients for civilization itself. Copper was the Bronze Age equivalent of steel, necessary for tools and weapons. Ebony and carnelian were the status symbols that reinforced social hierarchies. This ship was carrying the very lifeblood of its age, the economic foundation upon which kingdoms were built. This cargo map, however, leads to a geographical impossibility. A vessel laden with goods from Turkey and India simply could not have reached this point in the desert by any known ancient sea route. The solution to this riddle lies not in the ship's design or its contents, but in the very ground beneath it. The desert was not always a desert. 4,000 years ago, the climate of the Arabian Peninsula was dramatically different. Geological core samples, long cylinders of earth drilled from the depths of the sand, tell a silent story of profound change. They reveal layers of ancient lakebed silt and fossilized pollen from plants that cannot survive in arid conditions. This is the evidence of paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, and it paints a picture that is almost unrecognizable today. Where now there is only a vast ocean of sand, there were once sprawling networks of rivers and lush seasonal lakes. This was a green Arabia, a land crisscrossed by waterways that acted as liquid highways into the continent's interior. The ship did not sail to a desert, it sailed to a coast. It would have unloaded its precious cargo onto smaller riverboats, which then carried the goods deep inland along these now vanished rivers. The ship itself, perhaps damaged or simply at the end of its long service life, was likely hauled ashore for repair or retirement at a bustling trading settlement that has long since been erased by the dune. Its final resting place was once a vibrant port, a hub of international commerce on the edge of a fertile plain. This understanding transforms the discovery from a mere curiosity into a tragic landmark. The ship's presence marks not just a trade route but a lost world. Its stranding in the sand is a direct result of an environmental catastrophe. Around the time the ship was abandoned, the climate began to shift. The rains faltered, the rivers slowed to a trickle and then vanished entirely. The green gave way to brown and then to the relentless yellow of the advancing dunes. The port city was slowly suffocated, its people forced to leave, and the great ship was gradually buried, a monument to a world that dried up and blew away. This climatic collapse did not just strand a single vessel, it threatened the entire network it served. The very lifelines of this prehistoric global economy were disappearing. And when essential trade routes fail, the struggle for what remains begins. So who were the master builders behind this incredible vessel? The answer did not lie in a grand inscription or a king's seal, but in the subtle fingerprints left on the cargo itself. Among the copper ingots and ebony logs, archaeologists found shattered pieces of pottery. These were not the ship's fine tableware, but the humble, sturdy containers used to pack and protect the goods. The clay of these pots held a chemical signature, a unique blend of minerals that acted like a return address, pointing directly to their place of origin. That place was a region known today as Dilmun, a civilization centered on the islands of Bahrain and the eastern coast of Arabia. In ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Dilmun was described as a pure and holy land, a place of creation. But for archaeologists, it was something more practical, the Singapore of the Bronze Age. Dilmun was not a producer of vast quantities of raw materials itself. Instead, its power was logistical. It was the ultimate middleman, a mercantile hub that connected the great civilizations of the time. Ships from distant lands would converge on its ports, and Dilmunite merchants would facilitate the exchange of goods, taking a profit and sending commodities on their next leg of the journey. The design of the ship itself confirms this. Its construction, using imported cedar and advanced joinery, is consistent with a society whose entire identity and wealth were built upon seafaring. These were not occasional sailors, they were professionals. Their society was likely structured around trade guilds and merchant families, with knowledge of winds, currents, and foreign ports passed down through generations. Their motivation was not conquest but connection. They embarked on these perilous journeys across the open ocean because they understood the immense value of linking supply with demand. A piece of copper from Oman was worth little in Oman, but transported to the city-states of Mesopotamia, where metal was scarce, its value multiplied 100-fold. The Dilmunites were the architects of this value, the nervous system of a prehistoric global economy. They were a civilization whose name was indeed lost for millennia, but whose impact is now undeniable. They built the networks that allowed Bronze Age societies to flourish, and in doing so, they made themselves indispensable. But what happens when a system this vital begins to collapse? The destination for this incredible cargo was not a mystery, but a calculated endpoint. Every item in the ship's hold, from the Omani copper to the Indian ebony, was destined for a specific, hungry market. The ship's ultimate goal was almost certainly one of the great riverine cities of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In places like a city of towering ziggurats and bustling markets, these raw materials were the lifeblood of power and prestige. But the ship would not have sailed directly up the river. Its deep draft and large size made it an ocean-going vessel, not a riverboat, so where did it offload its precious goods? The evidence points to a network of coastal entrepôts, trading posts that acted as the crucial interface between the deep-sea traders and the inland empires. One such proposed destination is a site now buried under the dunes near where the ship was found. This would have been a bustling port town, a place where the languages of a dozen different cultures mixed in the air. Here, the massive copper ingots would have been transferred to smaller, flat-bottomed barges capable of navigating the shallower rivers leading north into the heart of Mesopotamia. The ebony logs, rare and heavy, would have been carefully unloaded, their value multiplying with every mile they traveled inland. This settlement was more than a simple dock, it was a prehistoric free trade zone. Local merchants would have bartered for a share of the goods, exchanging dates, dried fish, or pearls from the nearby gulf for a portion of the exotic cargo. The town itself would have thrived on this constant flow of commerce, its wealth built entirely on its strategic location. It was the last link in a chain that stretched across the ocean, and the first link in another that reached deep into the continent. This reveals a world of stunning economic interdependence. The cities of Mesopotamia, for all their architectural splendor, lacked essential resources. They had no local sources of metal for their tools and weapons, no fine hardwoods for their temples and palaces. Their survival and dominance depended entirely on networks like the one this ship served. In return, they exported finished goods, textiles, and perhaps most importantly, grain and other agricultural surpluses to feed the populations of the trading hubs. The ship's journey, therefore, was not an isolated adventure. It was a single, vital pulse in a continuous circulatory system that sustained entire civilizations. The demand for copper in directly fueled the mines of Oman, which in turn created the need for the Dilmunite shipping industry. This was a true globalized economy 4,000 years ago. But such a delicate web of reliance is also a web of vulnerability. When one thread is pulled, the entire structure can tremble. Yet among this wealth of resources, one type of cargo stood apart, carrying a weight far beyond its physical mass. It was not copper or ebony, but something more fundamental to the very structure of society, obsidian. This volcanic glass, with its razor-sharp edge, was the prehistoric equivalent of advanced surgical steel. A single piece could be knapped or skillfully fractured into blades so sharp they could cleanly slice through flesh and sinew, or into arrowheads that could pierce leather armor. For a society without metal tools, control over this material meant control over cutting technology itself. It was indispensable for butchery, for crafting other tools from wood and bone, and undoubtedly for warfare. But its value was not merely practical. Because of its rare, glassy beauty and its origin in fiery, otherworldly volcanoes, obsidian also held profound ritual significance. It was likely used in ceremonial objects, perhaps even in sacrificial rites, linking its possession to spiritual power and authority. This combination of supreme utility and deep symbolism made it a commodity of immense strategic importance. The chemical analysis revealed a chilling detail. The obsidian on the ship came from a single, highly specific source, a volcano in Anatolia. This was not a common material gathered from many places, it was a monopoly. The entire supply chain for this critical resource, from its extraction in distant Turkey to its distribution across the ancient world, was funneled through this one trade network. If you controlled that network, you controlled the sharpest technology on the planet. The Dilmunite merchants were the masters of this pipeline. They held the keys to a resource that could make a city-state dominant in both craft and combat. What would happen if that supply was threatened? If the climate began to choke the trade routes, or if a rival power decided they wanted a piece of this lucrative monopoly for themselves? The control of such a singular, vital resource would not be given up lightly. The struggle over it would not be a simple squabble. It would be a war fought with economic weapons, blockades, and redirected cargoes, a conflict where the ultimate prize was technological and spiritual supremacy. But a monopoly on something as vital as Obsidian never goes unchallenged for long. To the north and west of Dilmun's maritime domain, other powers were rising, their ambitions fueled by the same hunger for resources. The archaeological record reveals these rivals not through written declarations of war, but through the silent testimony of their own artifacts and fortifications. In Mesopotamia, the city-states of and Lhasa were reaching the peak of their power. These were not mere villages, but sprawling urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, governed by powerful kings who commanded standing armies. Their strength was agricultural, built on the immense fertility of the land between the rivers. They produced vast surpluses of grain, which could be used as a commodity to trade for the things they lacked. Their weakness was an almost total dependency on imported raw materials. They had no local metal, no stone, and no quality timber. Their entire military and economic might was precariously balanced on the steady flow of goods from distant lands, a flow controlled by the Dilmunite merchants. Further east, another civilization was reaching its zenith, the Indus Valley civilization, with its meticulously planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Their strength lay in manufacturing and mass production. Archaeological finds show they had standardized weights and measures, and workshops that produced vast quantities of distinctive carnelian beads and finely crafted pottery. They were a continental power with trade networks stretching deep into India, but they also looked westward towards the markets of Mesopotamia and the Gulf. They too needed resources like the copper from Oman that the Dilmunite ships carried. These were the three pillars of this prehistoric world, each with a distinct profile. Dilmun was the naval power, the master of logistics and long-distance transport. Mesopotamia was the agricultural and military powerhouse, a consumer civilization with a voracious appetite. The Indus Valley was the industrial workshop, a producer of luxury goods on an unprecedented scale. For a time, their interests aligned, creating a stable, if tense, symbiosis. But this balance was fragile. What would happen if the Mesopotamians, tired of paying the Dilmunite premium, decided to cut out the middleman? What if they sought to build their own ships and establish direct trade with the Indus Valley? Or what if the Indus Valley civilization, with its own sophisticated culture, began to send its own merchants westward by land and sea, bypassing the Dilmunite hubs entirely? The stage was set for a confrontation. The weapon would not be the sword but the trade route. The goal was not to destroy an enemy's army but to cripple their economy. This was a war where the most devastating blow would be a silent harbor and an empty warehouse. The struggle for Obsidian was a war fought with ledgers and manifests, not swords and shields. This was economic warfare, a prehistoric form of sanctions where the goal was to strangle a rival's prosperity without a single battle. Imagine a powerful Mesopotamian king, frustrated by the high prices demanded by Dilmunite merchants for that essential volcanic glass. His response would not be to launch a fleet, an endeavor for which he had no expertise, but to impose an embargo. He could decree that no grain, the lifeblood of the trading ports, would be exchanged for goods coming through Dilmunite ships. Suddenly, the bustling port city where our ship was found would face famine. The merchants, unable to feed their families or their workers, would be forced to capitulate or watch their entire economy collapse. This was a weapon that targeted civilians, making daily life untenable until political demands were met. Another tactic was the creation of artificial monopolies. A cunning ruler might secretly fund pirates to prey exclusively on the ships of his commercial rivals, creating a blockade without ever officially declaring one. The Dilmunites, masters of the sea, could have used their knowledge of hidden reefs and treacherous currents to guide their own vessels safely while subtly misleading competitors into disaster. The sabotage of a single key ship in a narrow channel could effectively close a trade route for months, allowing one power to seize control over the flow of a critical resource. The ultimate power, however, lay in creating dependency. By controlling the entire supply chain for a good like copper, from the mine to the marketplace, a merchant kingdom could make an entire civilization reliant on its goodwill. If the city-states of Mesopotamia wanted to arm their soldiers with bronze weapons, they had no choice but to deal with the middlemen who held the keys to the metal. This gave the traders immense political leverage. They could demand favorable terms, extract political concessions, or even influence the outcome of conflicts between inland kingdoms by choosing which one received vital supplies. This subtle, sophisticated understanding of power dynamics reveals that our ancient ancestors were not primitive. They were strategic thinkers who recognized that true dominance often comes not from destroying an enemy, but from controlling the very resources that allow them to exist. The silence of the archaeological record hides the whispers of these negotiations, the tense meetings in shadowy port offices where the fate of empires was decided by the flow of commodities. These silent economic battles left deep scars upon the earth. Without written chronicles of the conflict, the evidence for this trade war is written in stone and ash, in the ruins of settlements that guarded the ancient routes. The landscape itself became a battlefield. Archaeologists mapping the region have discovered a string of small, heavily fortified outposts positioned along what were once the vital inland paths from the coast. These were not major cities but military installations, their walls thick and their locations chosen for strategic oversight of a valley or a mountain pass. Their very existence speaks of a perceived threat, a need to protect the flow of goods from interception or attack. At some of these sites, a layer of charcoal and collapsed fire-blackened masonry tells a grim story. These outposts did not fall into disuse, they were violently destroyed. The burning was not an accident, it was a deliberate act, a message sent through flames to anyone who dared to control the route. Further evidence of sabotage points to attacks on the most critical resource in an arid land, water. Along these same trade corridors, ancient wells, painstakingly dug deep into the ground, were found filled with stones and debris. This is not the gradual siltation of time, it is the signature of intentional destruction. Contaminating or blocking a well was an act of economic and biological warfare, designed to make a route impassable. A caravan could not travel for long without water, and without caravans, the trading posts would wither and die. This tactic targeted the infrastructure itself, aiming to sever the connection between the coastal ports and the inland empires permanently. Perhaps the most telling clue, however, is the sudden silence in the artifact record. For centuries, distinctive Dilmunite seals and pottery styles appear consistently in Mesopotamian cities, a clear marker of active trade. Then, at a specific point in time corresponding with the climatic shift, those artifacts vanish. It is not a gradual decline, but an abrupt cutoff. Simultaneously, in the ruins of the port city near our ship, archaeologists find a sharp increase in weapons, sling stones stockpiled in courtyards, and hastily repaired fortifications. The distribution of goods tells the story. The trade did not slowly fade away, it was severed. The fortified outposts were burned, the wells were poisoned, and the flow of goods stopped completely. These are not the marks of peaceful economic change. They are the footprints of a desperate, violent struggle for survival, a prehistoric trade war fought over the last remaining drops of water and the final routes to prosperity. The ship's final voyage began with a routine that was centuries old. Laden with its precious cargo of copper, ebony, and that strategic monopoly of Anatolian obsidian, it sailed south from the Dilmun hub, its hull riding low in the water. The crew, seasoned mariners who knew the whispers of the wind and the patterns of the stars, would have expected a long but manageable journey down the coast, followed by a turn into the estuary of a now-vanished river that led to their inland port. They were the vital link, and this was just another pulse in the great circulatory system of trade. But on this journey, the world had changed. The familiar waterways they relied on were shrinking, their channels growing shallow and unpredictable as the drought tightened its grip. The safe harbors were becoming tense, fortified enclaves. The old rules of passage were breaking down. The ambush would not have been a dramatic naval battle with flaming arrows and grappling hooks. This was an economic war, and its violence was more insidious. The ship may have been lured into a trap, perhaps by a false signal fire on a headland, promising safe passage to a cove that was no longer safe. Or it could have been cornered by smaller, faster vessels crewed by rivals or pirates hired by a Mesopotamian king to disrupt the Dilmunite supply line. The goal was not to sink the vessel and lose its priceless cargo to the deep, but to seize it. The attackers would have wanted the ship intact, its wealth transferred to their own control, a direct blow to their competitors' economy. The evidence on the ground tells a story of a mission interrupted, not destroyed. The ship was found largely intact, not shattered by a storm or burned in a conflict. It was carefully or perhaps hastily hauled ashore. This suggests the crew, facing a superior force, made a desperate choice. They ran the ship aground in a familiar river mouth, hoping to hide it in the reeds or beach it at a settlement where they could regroup. But the settlement was already dying, its people fleeing the advancing desert. There were no allies left to help them defend their cargo. In the face of an imminent attack, the crew would have had only moments. They could not possibly unload tons of copper ingots and heavy ebony logs. Their priority would have been survival. They likely abandoned the ship, taking only what they could carry, fleeing into a landscape that was itself turning against them. The attackers, when they arrived, would have found a prize beyond belief, a king's ransom sitting silently on the riverbank, but they too were trapped by the changing world. The river was silting up, becoming impassable. They could not sail the heavy ship away, and they lacked the time or the means to transport its immense cargo overland. In a final act of economic sabotage, they may have done the only thing left. They sabotaged the ship itself, ensuring their rivals could not reclaim it. They might have drilled holes in the hull or damaged the steering oars, then left it to be slowly swallowed by the encroaching sand. The great freighter, a masterpiece of naval engineering, became a ghost at a dying port. Its cargo, the very engine of Bronze Age power, remained in its hold, not as treasure to be recovered later, but as a monument to a system that had collapsed. The sand did not bury a shipwreck, it entombed a stalemate in a silent war, leaving behind a perfect snapshot of a conflict frozen in time. The ship's stranding was not just an isolated misfortune, but a symptom of a planet-wide fever. While rival powers maneuvered for control over trade routes, a far greater force was altering the board upon which their game was played. The climate itself was shifting, turning from a reliable partner into a dangerous accomplice. Scientific data from ice cores and lake sediments around the globe confirm that around 4,200 years ago, the Earth experienced a prolonged and severe mega-drought. This was not a few bad seasons, it was a climatic event that lasted for centuries, destabilizing civilizations from the Aegean to the Indus Valley. In the Arabian Peninsula, the impact was catastrophic. The very lifeblood of the trade network, the network of rivers and seasonal lakes that made inland travel possible, began to vanish. A reliable waterway one year might be a muddy trench the next, and a bustling port town could find itself stranded miles from the nearest navigable channel. This environmental pressure acted as a threat multiplier, intensifying every existing dispute over resources. What had once been a stable, if competitive, trading relationship now became a desperate struggle for survival. As the water retreated, the number of viable routes shrank dramatically. A single, still passable river valley would become a contested choke point, a strategic prize worth fighting for. The fortified outposts that guarded these passages were no longer just protecting commerce. They were guarding the last remaining arteries of life in a world that was slowly dehydrating. The scarcity of water would have made the transportation of heavy goods like copper ingots nearly impossible, as the animal-drawn carts and human porters that moved them overland required vast amounts of water to sustain themselves. The cost of trade would have skyrocketed, and the temptation to seize a rival's cargo rather than pay the exorbitant price for it would have grown irresistible. In this context, the economic warfare we see evidence of takes on a new, more desperate character. Blockades and the sabotage of wells were not just aggressive business tactics, they were acts of geopolitical triage, attempts by one power to ensure its own survival by cutting off another. The desert that slowly engulfed the ship was not a passive grave, but an active participant in the conflict. It reshaped the landscape of power, turning abundance into scarcity and cooperation into a zero-sum game where for one civilization to live, another might have to be pushed into the sand. The weapons of this era blurred the line between the workshop and the battlefield. A farmer's axe designed to fell trees could just as easily shatter a human skull. A hunter's bow meant to bring down a gazelle could pierce the leather armor of a guard protecting a trade caravan. These were not specialized instruments of war, but multi-purpose tools whose function was determined by circumstance and desperation. Spears, with their long reach and simple construction of a sharpened stone or metal tip fastened to a wooden shaft, were likely the most common weapon. They were effective for keeping an opponent at a distance, whether that opponent was a wild animal or a rival fighter. Axes, both stone and the newer, more durable bronze versions, were brutal close-quarters tools capable of delivering crushing blows. Bows offered the only form of ranged attack, a critical advantage for ambushing a slow-moving caravan on a narrow trail or defending the walls of a fortified outpost. The nature of these weapons dictated the nature of the conflict. This was not the age of vast, organized armies clashing on open plains. Warfare was intimate, brutal, and often small-scale. A typical attack might involve a band of raiders, perhaps from a rival tribe or a community pushed to the brink by drought, lying in wait along a known trade route. Their goal was not conquest but plunder. The tactics would rely on surprise and overwhelming force applied to a vulnerable point. They would likely strike at dawn or dusk, using arrows to thin the ranks of the caravan guards before closing in with spears and axes to seize the goods. The high value of the cargo made such raids a calculated risk. A single successful ambush on a shipment of copper ingots could equip an entire village with new tools and weapons, dramatically shifting the local balance of power. But as the trade war intensified, these skirmishes could escalate. The burning of fortified outposts suggests larger, more coordinated assaults. Protecting a critical well or a mountain pass required a standing force, a group of fighters dedicated to defense. In these larger confrontations, the weapons remained the same, but the stakes were infinitely higher. This was no longer just about stealing wealth, it was about controlling the very infrastructure of survival. A fighter defending a well would not just be fighting for his life, he would be fighting for the survival of his entire community. The clash of a bronze axe against a wooden shield was not merely a sound of combat, it was the sound of an economic policy being enforced with sheer violence. This understanding transforms the abstract concept of a trade war into a visceral human drama. The struggle over Obsidian was not just fought in silent meetings, it was fought by individuals under a scorching sun, armed with tools they used every day, now turned against each other in a desperate bid to control the future. The echoes of that final, desperate skirmish did not fade with the last clash of bronze. They reverberated across the region, toppling civilizations like a chain of falling dominoes. The collapse of this single maritime artery triggered a catastrophic failure across the entire network. For the Dilmunite merchants, the masters of the sea lanes, the consequences were existential. Their entire society was built on the flow of goods, and when that flow stopped, their reason for being evaporated. Their ports, once bustling with international commerce, became ghost towns, their wealth withering as the sand dunes advanced. Archaeological evidence suggests that the heart of the Dilmun civilization experienced a sharp and sudden decline. Their distinctive seals vanish from the archaeological record, and their grand burial mounds show no new construction. They did not necessarily vanish as a people, but their power, their influence, and their unique role as the globe's first great logistical power were broken. They were the first and most direct casualty of this economic war, a society that prospered by connection and died by isolation. Their downfall, however, created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed new powers. With the sea routes controlled by Dilmun now severed or too dangerous, the great consumer civilizations were forced to adapt. In Mesopotamia, the city-states that had depended on imported copper and timber turned their ambitions inward and northward. They began to forge new overland alliances and launch military campaigns to secure resources closer to home, shifting their economic gravity away from the Persian Gulf and towards Anatolia and the Levant. This strategic pivot had a profound cultural impact. The art, the architecture, and even the religious practices of Mesopotamia began to reflect these new continental connections, slowly erasing the maritime influence of the Dilmun era. A new political map was being drawn not by diplomats but by necessity. Perhaps the most startling long-term effect was the rewiring of global consciousness. For centuries, the known world had been linked by the daring voyages of the Dilmunite sailors. They were the living proof that distant lands and strange peoples were connected in a single, interdependent system. When their ships stopped sailing, that worldview shattered. The world, for the societies that followed, likely seemed to shrink, becoming a more fragmented and isolated place. The knowledge of distant India or the mountains of Oman would have faded into legend, then into myth. The struggle over a single shipping route did not just change who traded with whom, it fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of its own reach. It set a new, more insular course for the centuries that followed, a course that would take generations to reverse. This is the ultimate power of a single event in history. It can not only change the balance of power, but it can also collapse an entire horizon of possibility, leaving future generations to rebuild a world their ancestors once knew. The silence of the desert and the clamor of myth may seem worlds apart, yet they are bound by the same human impulse to explain the unexplainable. Could the catastrophic collapse of this prehistoric trade network have left an echo so powerful it resonated for millennia, eventually finding its voice in the legends of later civilizations? The parallels are too striking to ignore. Consider the recurring theme of a great flood found in the Epic of Gilgamesh and later in the biblical story of Noah. A civilization built on river trade, watching its life-giving waterways vanish under a relentless drought or, conversely, being wiped out by a sudden, catastrophic deluge as the climate destabilized, would have experienced this as a world-ending event. The story of a single ship surviving the destruction, carrying the seeds of a new beginning, could easily transform over centuries from a traumatic memory into a foundational myth of survival and renewal. Similarly, tales of lost cities of immense wealth, like the Arabian legend of Aram of the Pillars or the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, mirror the fate of the bustling port towns that served the Dilmunite network. These were not mythical places of sin, but real centers of commerce that literally vanished under the sand. To the generations that followed, their sudden disappearance, leaving behind only faint traces, would have demanded an explanation. The truth, a slow death by drought and economic warfare, is less dramatic than legends of divine punishment for arrogance, but it served the same purpose, making sense of a landscape littered with the ghosts of a more prosperous age. Even the archetype of an epic quest for a priceless treasure guarded by monsters or rival kingdoms finds a chilling precedent. The struggle to control the Anatolian obsidian supply, a resource as valuable as any dragon's hoard, was a real-life quest that determined the fate of empires. The dangerous journey of the merchant sailors, navigating not only the physical perils of the sea but the economic threats of rivals, is the stuff of heroic saga. Over time, the specific commodity, obsidian, might be forgotten, replaced in story by a golden fleece or a magical artifact, but the core narrative of a perilous journey for a prize of immense power remains. This is how history becomes legend. The hard facts, the names of kings and the dates of battles are the first things to fade. What remains is the emotional core, the shared trauma of collapse, the awe of lost technology, and the lesson that prosperity is fragile. The story of our ship, entombed in the desert, is not just an archaeological puzzle. It is a potential seed crystal around which some of our oldest and most powerful stories may have formed, a forgotten truth wrapped in the beautiful, enduring cloak of myth. This pattern of conflict over commerce is not an isolated anomaly in the ancient world. We can see its echoes in later, better documented periods, where the struggle for resources escalated into full-blown economic warfare. Centuries after our Dilmunite ship was buried, the great empires of the Late Bronze Age, from the Hittites in Anatolia to the Egyptians in the Nile Valley, were locked in a complex, interdependent trade network. They exchanged letters on clay tablets, addressing each other as brother kings, while their merchants moved vast quantities of copper, tin, and luxury goods across the Mediterranean. Yet this system too collapsed in a cascade of failures around 1200 BCE, an event known as the Bronze Age collapse. Invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples are often blamed, but many historians now see the root cause in a breakdown of this very trade network. Drought and famine likely triggered a desperate scramble for remaining resources, turning former trading partners into rivals. The destruction of key port cities and the severing of tin trade routes, essential for making bronze, would have crippled every kingdom from Greece to Babylon. This later collapse mirrors our prehistoric one in a crucial way. It was not a single military defeat that caused the fall, but the unraveling of a complex economic web. The comparison, however, also reveals what makes the Dilmunite conflict so extraordinary. The Bronze Age collapse happened among literate, centralized states that left behind detailed records of their diplomacy and their downfall. Our prehistoric trade war occurred 1,000 years earlier, among powers whose names were almost completely lost to history. They achieved a level of globalization without the bureaucracy of later empires, relying on merchant guilds and oral agreements rather than royal decrees inscribed on palace walls. This earlier system was arguably more fragile, yet it proves that the drive to control resources and the violent consequences of that struggle are not products of advanced civilization. They are fundamental forces that emerge whenever human societies connect over great distances. The real pattern is not that trade leads to war, but that the immense benefits of connection always come with vulnerability. When a system built on mutual need is stressed by scarcity, whether from climate change or political ambition, cooperation can shatter into competition with stunning speed. The silent war fought over a desert ship was not the first of its kind, and it would certainly not be the last. For all its incredible testimony, this ship remains a silent witness. It tells us what happened, but rarely who or why in the precise human terms we crave. We can reconstruct the trade routes and the economic pressures, but we cannot hear the captain's final orders as the ship was run aground. We cannot know the names of the crew, the families they left behind, or the personal loyalties that might have driven their actions. Were they seasoned Dilmunite professionals or a more diverse group hired from different ports? Did they perish in the attack, or did they manage to flee into a landscape turning to dust, their story lost with them? The ship's timbers hold no roster, no personal effects that survived the millennia to give these individuals a voice. The precise sequence of that fateful day is another void. Did the confrontation last for hours, or was it a swift, shocking ambush? Was the ship abandoned in a panic, or was it a deliberate, sorrowful decision made by a crew realizing there was no escape? Archaeology gives us the crime scene, but not the moment-by-moment drama. These are the intimate human details that evaporate with time, the whispers that the desert winds have long since carried away. This inherent limitation is not a failure of science, but a fundamental characteristic of history itself. The past is a vast puzzle, and we are left to assemble it with only a fraction of the pieces. Some fragments are monumental, like the ship itself, while others, like a single fingerprint in the clay of a pottery shard, are infinitesimally small. Yet the most crucial pieces, the thoughts, fears, and hopes of the people who lived it, are almost always missing. Embracing this uncertainty does not weaken our investigation, it deepens it. It introduces a necessary humility, a recognition that our understanding of the past is a best interpretation, a sketch that will never be completely filled in. The desert, having preserved this incredible snapshot for 4,000 years, ultimately keeps its most profound secrets locked away forever, reminding us that some mysteries are meant to endure. The desperation to protect a cargo of obsidian may have forged more than just alliances. The constant threat of interception on those shrinking trade routes created a powerful incentive for innovation, pushing ancient engineers to their limits. We can see this pressure reflected in the ship's own advanced design, but the conflict likely spurred developments far beyond a single hull. Consider the challenge of navigation. With familiar coastal landmarks becoming obscured by sand and safe harbors turning hostile, sailors would have needed more reliable methods. This could have accelerated the development of celestial navigation, using the stars not just as guides for general direction, but as precise tools for plotting a course across open water, away from dangerous shores. The need for speed and stealth would have driven changes in ship design itself. While our discovered vessel was a heavy freighter, the era may have also seen the rise of newer, lighter, and faster scout ships or escort vessels, designed not for capacity but for reconnaissance and defense. These would be the patrol craft of their day, built to outrun pirates and secure the lucrative sea lanes. On land, the same pressures applied. The struggle to control fortified outposts and protect caravans would have demanded better weapons. This might have led to refinements in metallurgy, as smiths experimented with new alloys or forging techniques to produce bronze that was harder, held a sharper edge, or was less brittle in combat. The very act of coordinating these defenses over long distances, of managing supply lines for remote garrisons, would have honed skills in logistics and communication. Runners carrying messages between outposts would need to move faster and more secretly. The organization required to mount a coordinated defense across a vast territory was a form of social technology, a precursor to the complex administrations of later empires. In this light, the trade war becomes a brutal but effective crucible. The relentless need to adapt to protect wealth and simply to survive forced these societies to think smarter and build better. The technologies born from this conflict, whether a new way to read the stars or a stronger bronze spearhead, did not disappear when the particular war ended. They became part of the shared toolkit of humanity, passed down and improved upon, their origins in a desperate struggle for Obsidian long forgotten but their impact echoing through the ages. This single ship, stranded in its sandy grave, was never an isolated wanderer. It was a vital junction in a web of connections so vast it redefines our image of the ancient world. Think of it not as a solitary vessel, but as a single active terminal in a planetary network, a prehistoric internet of goods and ideas. To reconstruct this system, we must follow the trails left by its cargo, mapping a world that thrived on interdependence. The journey begins at the source. Deep in the mountains of Oman, miners extracted the copper that filled the ship's hold. This was not a small-scale operation, but an industrial undertaking involving hundreds of workers, organized labor, and sophisticated smelting techniques to produce those distinctive ox-hide-shaped ingots. From there, the ingots were transported to the coast, likely on the backs of donkeys or in carts, to a Dilmunite-controlled port. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, thousands of miles to the east, artisans in specialized workshops were drilling those perfect carnelian beads, their hands moving with a skill born from generations of practice. Their finished products were gathered by local merchants, who then brought them to major river ports like those near Mohenjo-Daro, where Dilmunite ships would be waiting. The network pulsed with similar activity in Anatolia, where obsidian was quarried, and in India, where ebony logs were cut and prepared for their long journey west. Each point on this map was a specialized cell in a single economic body. The mines of Oman were the muscle producing raw power. The workshops of the Indus Valley were the skilled hands creating objects of beauty and status. The agricultural fields of Mesopotamia were the stomach, producing the food surplus that fueled the entire system. And the Dilmunite merchants were the circulatory system, the arteries and veins that connected every organ, ensuring that resources reached the places where they were most needed and most valued. This was not a simple series of bilateral trades. It was a complex, multi-directional flow. A Dilmunite ship might leave the Gulf carrying dates and pearls from its homeland, sail to the Indus Valley to trade for carnelian beads and cotton textiles, then head to Oman to pick up a load of copper, before finally making the journey up the coast to offload everything in Mesopotamia. The profit was made at every exchange, and the ship returned home not empty, but with Mesopotamian grain and finely crafted goods to be distributed locally or used as capital for the next voyage. This system required a staggering degree of trust and standardization. How did a merchant in Oman know the value of a bundle of cloth from a place he had never seen? They relied on systems of standardized weights, often made of stone and meticulously calibrated, which have been found across this entire region. A weight in Oman matched a weight in Mesopotamia, ensuring a fair trade. They used distinctive seals pressed into clay tags attached to goods, acting as a form of brand certification or origin marking. This was a world speaking the universal language of commerce long before it had a common tongue for poetry or law. The scale of this connectivity forces us to abandon the image of isolated, simple village societies. 4,000 years ago, a person in the great city of Ur could own a bead crafted in the Indus Valley, a vase imported from the Iranian plateau, and a copper mirror made from ore mined in Oman. Their daily life was touched by a global economy. This prehistoric world system was as complex and fragile as our own, a testament to humanity's enduring drive to reach beyond the horizon and weave the world together through trade. But these copper ingots and obsidian blades were never just commodities. They were the life's work of real people, men and women whose names are lost to the sand. We can analyze trade routes and economic collapse, but the true weight of this story is felt in the silence they left behind. Consider the miner in Oman, swinging his stone hammer in the suffocating dark, his lungs filled with dust, dreaming of the price his labor would fetch in a distant city. Think of the sailor on that ship, his hands calloused from hauling ropes, staring at the endless horizon, wondering about the family waiting for him back in Dilmun. His fear was not of abstract market forces, but of pirates, of storms, of the simple human error that could send his entire world to the bottom of the sea. For the craftsman in the Indus Valley, painstakingly polishing a carnelian bead for weeks, this bead was not just an item for trade. It was his masterpiece, his ticket to providing for his children, a tiny piece of his identity sent out into the unknown. These individuals did not think in terms of prehistoric globalization or climatic shifts. They thought in terms of a good harvest back home, a successful voyage, a healthy child. Their aspirations were profoundly human, and their fears were equally immediate. The collapse of this trade network was not just an economic statistic. It was the moment the sailor's wages stopped reaching his family. It was the day the miner's ore had no one left to buy it. It was the realization for the craftsman that his skill was no longer needed. This shift from prosperity to desperation would have happened one household at a time, a slow, creeping dread as the caravans became less frequent and the familiar ships failed to appear on the horizon. The burning of a fortified outpost was not just a strategic loss. It was the death of the guards who manned its walls, men who may have signed up for the job simply to feed their parents. The poisoning of a well was an act of violence against every woman and child who relied on it for their daily survival. By focusing only on the artifacts, we risk missing the heartbeat of history. These objects are the echoes of choices made by people who loved, hoped, and struggled just as we do. They navigated a world of immense change, their personal stories swept up in currents of climate and commerce they could scarcely comprehend. Their legacy is a reminder that behind every grand historical narrative, there are countless untold stories of quiet courage and profound loss. The ghosts of those ancient sailors and merchants speak to us across 4,000 years, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a stark reflection of our own world. The patterns are unnervingly familiar. The prehistoric struggle to control the flow of obsidian, a resource as vital to its age as oil is to ours, reveals a timeless truth about power and dependency. Today, global tensions simmer not over volcanic glass, but over petroleum reserves, rare earth minerals essential for our smartphones and green technology, and the control of critical shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. The Dilmunite merchants of old, with their mastery of maritime logistics, find their modern equivalent in the corporations and nations that command the container ships and pipelines forming the backbone of our 21st century economy. The fundamental dynamic remains unchanged, a fragile interdependence where the control of a single critical resource can grant immense geopolitical leverage. The lesson from the desert ship is not that trade leads to conflict, but that any system built on intense reliance is inherently vulnerable. When the ancient climate shifted, that vulnerability was exposed with catastrophic results. Our modern system faces its own set of pressures, from climate change disrupting agriculture to political instability, threatening supply chains for everything from computer chips to medical supplies. The collapse of the Bronze Age network shows us what happens when resilience is sacrificed for pure efficiency. A system with only one route for a vital good, like the single source of Anatolian obsidian, is a system poised for failure. The ancient response was fortification and economic warfare, strategies that ultimately led to a dead end buried in sand. Our challenge is to learn from their silence. Can we build economic networks that are not only efficient but also diversified and fair? Can we create systems where cooperation is more profitable than sabotage, and where the benefits of global connection are shared more broadly, reducing the desperation that fuels conflict? The silent ship in the desert is a monument to a system that broke under pressure. It asks us an urgent question as we navigate our own age of scarcity and connection. Will we choose a different path? Separating the solid ground of discovery from the shifting sands of speculation is essential. The story of this desert ship is so extraordinary that it naturally invites grand theories, some of which can drift far from the evidence. A common misconception is that the ship was discovered fully intact, a perfect time capsule. In reality, the vessel was a fragmented wreck, its timbers scattered and compressed by the immense weight of the sand over millennia. Reconstructing its original form was a painstaking puzzle for archaeologists, not a matter of simply brushing off a pristine hull. Another popular idea is that the ship's cargo held a single, unimaginable treasure, like a king's ransom in gold. While the copper, ebony, and obsidian were incredibly valuable in their time, they were the standard bulk commodities of long-distance trade, not a unique hoard. Their true worth lies not in mythical riches, but in the irrefutable economic map they provide. We must also be cautious about assigning a definitive cause for the ship's final voyage. While the evidence strongly points to economic conflict exacerbated by climate change, we cannot say for certain that a specific king ordered an attack on a specific date. The archaeological record shows patterns of violence and collapse, not a documented battle plan. This is where the scientific method becomes our most valuable tool. Every major claim about this ship, from its age to its origins, is backed by multiple, independent lines of evidence. The radiocarbon date is confirmed by tree ring analysis. The source of the cedar wood is verified through botanical studies. The origin of the obsidian is pinpointed by its unique chemical fingerprint. This is not guesswork, it is a convergence of proof where geology, chemistry, and archaeology all tell the same story. This rigorous process does not make the story less fascinating, it makes it more profound. The truth that a sophisticated global network existed and then fractured under real-world pressures is more compelling than any myth. It connects us to the tangible struggles and achievements of our ancient ancestors, reminding us that their world, though distant, was built on the same foundations of ingenuity and survival as our own. The sand may have given up one of its greatest secrets, but the excavation site remains a hive of activity. Far from being a concluded chapter, the discovery of the desert ship has opened a new frontier for archaeology, one guided by technologies that border on science fiction. Ground-penetrating radar now pulses invisible waves deep into the Earth, mapping subterranean features without moving a single grain of sand. These scans have already revealed the ghostly outlines of what appear to be foundations, storage pits, and perhaps even other vessels buried nearby, hinting that the ship was not alone but part of a larger port complex waiting to be unearthed. The most tantalizing possibilities, however, lie in the microscopic world. Scientists are now applying techniques like residue analysis to the very pottery shards found in the ship's hold. By studying the chemical traces left inside these ancient containers, they can determine what they once held. Was it wine, olive oil, or a grain long since extinct? Even more profound is the potential for ancient DNA analysis. Imagine recovering genetic material from a single seed, a scrap of leather, or even the dental calculus on a forgotten tooth, if human remains are ever found. This could reveal not just what people traded, but what they ate, what diseases they carried, and ultimately their genetic heritage, connecting them to populations across the ancient world. The great unanswered questions now drive the trowels. Who exactly manned this ship? Were they a crew from a single culture or a more diverse group, a Bronze Age United Nations of the Sea? What was the precise nature of the conflict that stranded them? Did it involve a single catastrophic event or a slow, grinding siege of attrition? Future discoveries might finally provide a human face to this drama, a name on a broken seal, a personal inscription on a weapon, or a burial that tells a story of injury and last stands. The true legacy of this ship may not be the story it has already told, but the countless new narratives it is poised to reveal, reminding us that the past is not a static relic, but a living, breathing puzzle whose final pieces are still being gently brushed clean.